Hello, my name is Rob Good, and welcome to this episode of Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone else who wants a quick dose of history. Thanks for joining us today. In every episode, my esteemed colleague Eric Hahn and I interview a historian about their scholarship. We ask them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include free lesson plans that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. Eric, what is our focus for today?
Today, Rob, we're going to explore some ideas to think about when teaching and learning about ancient Egypt. I know that you have experience with that, having tasted some crystallized honey from ancient Egypt, I think. I don't know. Teachers who cover this topic are most likely familiar with covering the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms spanning more than 1,500 years, starting maybe sometime in the 3rd century BCE. I don't know. We could talk more about chronology, perhaps. No small task. Students are always fascinated by the usual mummies and pyramids, maybe even since their elementary school days. But there's so much more to learn. Part of the purpose of this podcast is to find ways to come to grips with thinking about huge topics with some efficiency. And we hope to accomplish that with this ancient civilization today.
Well, like the students, I've been fascinated by Egypt since I was a boy, and the King Tut exhibit swept across the nation. But like many teachers, I struggle to find key themes to move students beyond superficial understanding of ancient Egypt, and I can't wait to learn more. Who's our historian for today?
Today, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Julia Troche to take on the daunting challenge of discussing thousands of years of history in 15 to 20 minutes. Julia is an Egyptologist and associate professor of history at Missouri State University. In 2022, she was awarded the university's highest teaching award. Julia's areas of instruction and research include social history, religion, archaeology, digital humanities, and antiquity. Julia has published widely on the topic of, including her first book, Death, Power, and the Apotheosis in Ancient Egypt, the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and her newest book, The God Ptah in Ancient Egyptian Religion and Society, should be released soon as of this recording. She also is completing a new textbook on life in antiquity. How do you have time to do anything? So teachers, be on the lookout for all of that.
Well, that's going to keep it short because she's got to get back to all this work. With this, so welcome, Julia, Professor Troche. What would you say are the most important ideas about ancient Egypt that teachers should teach and students should know regarding this time period?
Thank you so much for having me. I will say that textbook is probably going to come out first. So teachers can kind of keep an eye out for that. That is a social history of the ancient world, of the ancient Near East, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And so some of what I'm going to be sharing is going to be drawing from that. And I think the big question of what's the most important sort of concepts for thinking about ancient Egypt, for learning or teaching ancient Egypt, is, I think, can be encapsulated by the concept or the dual concept of continuity and change. As you both have already said, Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history, is over 3,000 years of human history. Think about the fact that America has been around for 250, right? We're about to, rather, the United States. And so if we're thinking about history in the United States versus history of ancient Egypt, like the vastness of that time perhaps becomes a little bit more poignant. And so one of the biggest sort of critiques or challenges I see in folks teaching Egyptian history who maybe aren't as familiar with it is that it's really easy to just make it seem as though it's one big thing, and to sort of generalize ancient Egypt as X without really giving any nuance to change over time. That being said, there were some things that really did stay fairly consistent in different moments of Egyptian history. And so that's why I like this idea of continuity and change. And so we can sort of look at certain themes and see how they stay the same and see how they change across time. And that provides a way to sort of zoom in while also nuancing different moments of Egyptian history. And so just for example, one of the things we can look at is really obvious is kingship. The idea that there is a king in Egypt throughout the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms and into the Greek and Roman eras as well is consistent. And that king is nearly always associated with Osiris in death and Horus in life. And so we see this imagery and this iconography perpetuated throughout the 3 millennia of Egyptian history. Yet, specific kings are quite distinct and kingship manifests quite differently across the different kingdoms. The term pharaoh, for example, doesn't even show up until the New Kingdom. And so we really shouldn't be talking about pharaohs building the pyramids, because the pyramids are only the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And we only have that title of pharaoh in the New Kingdom, like 1000 BC or 1500 BCE versus 2700 BCE. And so, I think there's some things we can look at. I can give some more examples of that if you'd like, of sort of thinking about kingship and change across time. But that's sort of my general biggest piece of advice, is just pick a few different things you want to look at, and then look at how they stay similar and how they change across time. And that could be up to a teacher's sort of preference and interest. It could be religion, it could be kingship, it could be, certain sort of type of statuary, right? It could be different types of literature, or different types of genre of texts that change across time. Like, another quick example I'll give is if we think about funerary literature. So there's the pyramid texts in the Old Kingdom, then there's the coffin texts in the Middle Kingdom, and then there's the books of the Netherworld, most famously the Book of the Dead, in the New Kingdom. And now that's a little bit of a generalization, but still we kind of have these big changes across the three major sort of big kingdoms that we think of when we think of ancient Egyptian history. And so that's a way of looking at, well, we still have this very similar type of mortuary text, a funerary text, but quite different. There's a lot of change as well, and not just in what the texts say, but who has access to the text. And so there's so many ways of getting at that and looking at things like continuity and change through these different avenues and pathways into Egyptian history. So really, the beauty of Egyptian history is that it allows for teachers to have so much flexibility in how they approach it. That's also the challenge.
I think that's great, and I think teachers probably will take you up on that type of flexibility. Keeping with continuity and change, do you have any advice on looking at kingship? I know there are a few queens too, that transfer of power from old, middle, and then you said new is really when pharaohs emerge. How would teachers focus on that?
Yeah, so I would say for the Old Kingdom, I would focus in and sort of zoom in on the pyramids, right? And so the Great Pyramids of Giza, this is a really sort of poignant example of kingship and the power manifesting kingship. And specifically, I like to look at the king whose name is Khafre. And I like to use ancient Egyptian sort of terminology as much as possible. So the Greeks and later folks came in and gave new names to a lot of these people and places, like Cheops or Khephren. You might have also read names spelled in that way. So Khafre is associated with Khephren, but I prefer to use Khafre. That's Khafre. And that's sort of the more Egyptian emic internal name for that king. And so he built one of the Great Pyramids at Giza, and the Sphinx is probably his as well. That's what most scholars think. And he has this great statue that's in the Cairo Museum called Khafre Enthroned. And so one of the things that I know a lot of students are interested in, and a lot of teachers, is how the king relates to divinity. Is the king a god on earth? And that changes very much across time. And I would argue that the king is not a god on earth for most of Egyptian history. And that's different than actually what a lot of textbooks might say. So at the very beginning, the king in the Old Kingdom, so again, we're looking at, let's say, 2700 BCE to about 2350 BCE. So if you're just trying to remember one number, let's just say 2500. Old Kingdom 2500. That at least gives you kind of an anchor point. The king is very close to the gods, is very much supported by the gods, but is not necessarily a god on earth. And so that Khafre enthroned statue, I think, perfectly exemplifies that existence. When you look at the statue straight on, all you see is Khafre. And he has that classical Egyptian Nemes headdress. He's seated in a throne. He's very sort of youthful and strong in his posture. It's only if you sort of go around to the side of the statue and you look at a picture that's from the side that you see there is a falcon behind his head. That is Horus. And that is Horus supporting him, but from behind him. And it's only if you kind of look at the very top of his head, you can just see the Horus falcon head kind of peeking over his head. So it's very subtle. So that means that when you're seeing the king, it's the king first and foremost, the mortal, corporeal human with a body. And the gods are just there kind of behind supporting. By the time we get to Dynasty 30, which is near the end of Egyptian history, right, in terms of the dynasties at least. Then we have the Greeks and Romans. You look at King Nectanebo. Nectanebo has another statue, and I believe this one is in the Met, that has Horus depicted with him. But in this example, Horus is massive. I mean, it's a figurine, so it's still not huge. But Horus is nice and big. And in between the legs of Horus, you almost can miss him, is standing Nectanebo. And so you really see the complete shift. And by that point, Egypt is a theocracy. So really the gods are ruling and the kings are just our manifestations of that power on earth. And so you can really see that broad shift in just sort of divine, quote unquote, divine kingship, or the king's role with the divine between those two statues, and how Horus and the king are interrelated and sort of supporting each other. And then I think if we want to look at a couple examples in the middle, I think a great example is to look at Senwosret III, who is this Middle Kingdom king. So Middle Kingdom, think 2000 BCE. So Old Kingdom, 2500, Middle Kingdom, you can think 2000 BCE. Senwosret III has a couple different statues where he's shown as wise, we think kind of older. He has sort of a droopier face, bigger ears. He has a very sort of different visual depiction of kingship than a lot of the other kings, which were very idealized and youthful and strong. Now, that being said, his body is still youthful and strong, but it's his face that really sort of shows a different type of kingship. And so you can sort of do a deep dive into that. And then I think, again, if you want to look at the New Kingdom, which let's say that's 1500 to 1000 BCE, to give you some nice rounder numbers, look at Hatshepsut, who is this female king, this woman king who rules very much as king, as pharaoh at that point. And you can see some of the shifts in her statuary where she depicts herself in a more feminine form early on when she is co-regent, when she is queen. And then as she takes on more attributes of traditional quote unquote kingship, she starts depicting herself a bit more masculine in dress and in stance and things like that. And the Met, again, has a Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Met has a lot of these statues as well that you can find online, really good images of this. And I'll try to link to some of those as well for you all.
Oh, thank you.
That was a lesson in and of itself. Thank you so much. The teachers are out there taking notes like we are. So I'm going to ask, you mentioned the difference between the three texts. So moving from pyramid text to coffin text to the books of the netherworld. Are there themes, if teachers wanted to sort of grab onto that to talk about continuity and change? What are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences in how those texts present themselves?
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the best ways of approaching this is thinking about who has access to display these texts. There's big debate about who had access to the spells themselves, because it's very possible that what we see written in the Old Kingdom in the pyramids, which are exclusive to the kings, would have been orally pronounced and performed for other elites, but they just didn't have the sort of decorum or the authority to write it and record it in their tombs. That was a sort of exclusive privilege of the king. And that doesn't mean that other people didn't hear it or have access to it in some other way. This big debate is about the quote unquote democratization of the afterlife, because coffin texts, then we see these coffin texts, which are derivative of the pyramid texts in most instances, are very much related, on private persons' coffins, on non-royal coffins. And so it seems like by the time we get to the Middle Kingdom, now more people have access to these texts. There's some debate, though, that it might not be so much that more people have access, but people now are able to show and put it in writing. And so it might be more a question of display than access, but this is like part of the big fun debate, right? But either way, just thinking about who can see these texts, who can interact with these texts. So if they're in as textual or material objects. And so if they're in the pyramids, well, that's going to be exclusive to the kings and the gods, right? And to the high priests in that sense. If they're on coffins, people are seeing these coffins as part of the burial procession, as part of the funeral procession. More people are having access and visibly seeing these types of texts. By the time we get to the New Kingdom and the Book of the Dead, for example, this is written on a scroll. And so this is something also that you are encountering in the market, right? And so we know that there are examples of Book of the Dead spells and scrolls, because there's no actual book. These are sets of scrolls and sets of spells that are combined in different ways onto these scrolls. And we have examples of scrolls where the text is written out, but the name is empty. And so probably what happened is if you're really wealthy, you could get the scroll written how you wanted it. But other folks will probably go to the market and say, all right, I'm going to get this one that has 3 spells on it. And can you, scribe, put in my name? And then they'll put in your name and kind of personalize it for you. But it's a sort of formed set of spells. Like, you're not picking necessarily the spells yourself. And so there's probably sort of different access points there. But I think that's a good sort of lens to look at these different texts. Who had access to them? Who was experiencing them? Who was sort of seeing them? And then within the texts themselves, I just think the nature of life after death. And of course, I don't mean, I don't think any Egyptians thought that there were zombies wandering ancient Egypt. There's no living dead necessarily in that capacity, but there is a sense of social capacity and sort of efficacy, life that continues after death. And looking at how that is communicated across these different texts, I think is really interesting and speaks to the larger sort of framework of why there's such an investment in mortuary culture, is because the ancient Egyptians believed that there was continued life after death. And so you want to build these tombs and have all these funerary equipment and all these things for the dead and prepare yourself for death because life continues. And so getting at and thinking about these texts through that sort of lens allows you then to sort of also explore these other sort of worldview beliefs and practices through those texts and through an analysis of those texts. And then that can like lead you on to look at tombs if you want to, and look at other material culture as well.
Right.
Can I ask can I ask a quick, just a real
we only
quick,
have a minute or two.
I know. Well, then I won't.
No, you can.
Okay, so the question I have is...
We're gonna do double barreled here, because you ask your question, I'm gonna ask mine, and then maybe you can try to...
Yeah, so the question I have is, what contributes to that democratizing? So if students were to think of the change over time and the access to these these texts, what sort of contributed to that? And that's a big span.
Okay, change over time with text. And then my question, Julia, is... I really like what you said about a lot of textbooks that students and teachers use may offer some misconceptions, like leaders are God on earth and that sort of thing. Are there other misconceptions that you found in your research that people seem to take as mainstream knowledge that's maybe a bit off? So you've got those 2 questions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And they kind of relate. So I think even in this conversation, I've talked about the big kingdoms, but there are these big periods in between the kingdoms called intermediate periods, the first, second, and third being the big 3. And it's those intermediate periods where you don't have centralized kingship, where Egypt is decentralized and ruled by regional nomarchs or governors. That's when you have this change in access. That's why more people have access to these things, because you no longer have an authoritarian ruler controlling access. And so in these intermediate periods, you have what might be described in some of the textbooks, and this is, again, sort of a misconception to your question, is periods of backwardness, right? Or periods of chaos. They weren't chaos, they just weren't centralized. And it's actually probably periods of incredible creativity and exploration and experimentation that's happening in that time that then gets codified in the next kingdom. So kings take that sort of creativity and that exploration and science and art and all these things that are happening, and then they sort of get the best of the best, and that's what's codified in the next sort of generation. And so I think thinking about kingship as being, Egypt only being these periods of authoritarian rule, well, that's a misconception in of itself. Real quickly, I'll say that the pyramids were absolutely built by ancient Egyptians, and they were not built by enslaved peoples. We have no evidence, at least, to positively say that they were built by enslaved peoples. We do have texts that talk about how the pyramid workers were getting paid. We do have archaeological remains of their barracks where the workers were sleeping on site. And we do have evidence of how they're building the pyramids. And so there's nothing to suggest that they were enslaved peoples or that they were built by anything or anyone other than the ancient Egyptians themselves. And the tombs, the pyramids, are giant tomb markers. They weren't grain silos or anything else. We have grain silos for ancient Egypt. And so I think those are some of the biggest misconceptions and things to sort of keep in mind. And then the last little bit I'll say is that we often sort of forget about the Greco-Roman period and sort of remove that from our conversation of ancient Egypt, but there's still all these things happening when the Greeks and Romans are also ruling Egypt. I just like to always highlight, and I kind of end maybe with this point, we are closer in time to Cleopatra, the last of the Greek rulers, and Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, we're closer in time to them than they were to the Great Pyramids at Giza.
Oh, wow.
And so when we think about
great perspective.
Right. We think
Yeah.
of Augustus. Well, that's ancient history, right? And we teach, and I teach all of ancient history, but we are closer in time to Augustus and Julius Caesar than they were to Khafre, who built one of the Great Pyramids at Giza. And so that's just a really nice, I think, way of sort of thinking about the vastness of this time.
Thank you, Dr. Julia Troche, for joining us. You've become a friend of this podcast. We may have to have you back after your further research, and you've really clarified a lot of points for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Bob?
I want to add my thanks, and thanks to our listeners for listening today. And remember, you can download the lessons associated with this episode from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Julia Troche did the seemingly impossible, ancient Egypt, in about 15 minutes. She shared an amazing website showing the statue of the enthroned Khafre, King Khafre, not Pharaoh, as we learned on the podcast. The lesson I developed simply has students go to the 3D image on the website provided. Students then find Horus behind Khafre's head supporting him. If teachers want to ramp this lesson up, I'd recommend visiting sites that show statuary from the New Kingdom and comparing how Horus is much more part of the imagery, as Julia mentioned. She has some fantastic resources available to you. Rob?
Yeah, and we will have links to those resources on the episode notes.
You know we will.
You got it. And that is a great lesson, Eric, and the students will love both the content and the stylish way it's presented. My lesson builds on Dr. Troche's observations about continuity and change over time regarding ancient Egypt funeral traditions and mortuary texts. The lesson asks students to analyze pyramid texts, coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead to explore ways that these texts became more accessible, as Julia mentioned, from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom. And students will also examine how ancient Egyptians' beliefs and traditions remain consistent over that long period of time.
Analyze period texts. That's fantastic, Rob. Thank you for listening. And remember, you can download the free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. And be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Rob will tell you how.
You can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. History in 20 is all spelled out. We'd love to hear from you. We're very lonely. Thank you for joining us today.